If you could all please find your seats and be seated. Could you also all turn off or put on vibrate all those telephones, please? Silence those buzzers, etc. Good evening, one and all. We're waiting for the noise to die down somewhat. Good evening, one and all. We're opening this evening with a tradition. It's a new tradition in the framework of our annual conference. Please, could everyone try and let us begin. We're starting with a tradition that we've started with our annual conference, which is a counter-terrorism conference, wherein we bring the previous heads of our security entities in Israel, or defense entities, someone who stood for many a year in a specific role and grew from that same framework of our security or defense entity. And we bring them all together in an encounter. And the objective of this deliberation is to try and understand how each of those personages sitting here with us sees what has happened in the international arena, stressing specifically what happened in the terror arena, and what is his forecast that he believes that one should prepare oneself for in the coming year. What are the challenges of those decision makers and perhaps the heads of the system today, those who have taken over in their roles and taken over in their positions, should take into account while running the security and defense systems and networks. This evening, in addition, we're working on with a different methodology than in previous conferences, because we asked those speakers not only to come and give some kind of speech, and believe me, those who are with us here on the podium could fill an entire evening with what they have to say, which I'm sure would be fascinating to each and every one of us, but we also asked them to open with a certain opening short speech, but more in the discussion that will develop after their opening talks. And that's what we're interested in. I prepared a set of questions wherein the questions are divided into the Shiite, the Palestinian, the global, the various different segments of that arena and arenas themselves. And I will try and integrate questions from the audience into that and create some kind of what we shall call a staccato discussion, so that ultimately we will be able to try and reach certain insights, all of us together, and perhaps even try and understand and look upon the various viewpoints here that we've heard tonight. So we're going to have three different parts to this evening. We're going to first ask each of those speakers to speak for about 10 minutes, exactly about those topics that we spoke about, their assessments about the year that has passed and the year that is now ahead of us, and then we will have that deliberation, that discussion, and then ultimately at 5 minutes at the end to try and perhaps summarize their insights after that discussion. What kind of derivatives can one say, or insights can be derived from what they heard this evening for their future? So I'm delighted to open this evening, and I would like in brief to say a little bit about those who are here on the stage with us, and that way I won't have to present each of them before they speak. And I'll start with Mr. Shlomo Aharonishky, who was the former Commissioner of Police Israel. He is on my far left. He was born in Kibbutz Dafna and joined the army in '67 in the engineering corps of the army. And in '81, he was lent to the police force as a sabotage expert. During that, in the police force, he was sort of lent from the IDF, and he was in various positions there. He was head of various commissions there in the army until he was actually appointed as the Commissioner of Police in July 94. Sorry. I'm just going to give you the essence about each of their biographies. At his right-hand side is Major General Aharon Zeevi Farkash, who immigrated in 1962 at the age of 14. And he served in the IDF for about 40 years, serving in various positions, those in the intelligence force of the army, military intelligence. He was the head of the gathering of information unit in the Israeli, which is the 8-2000 unit, and the head of the logistics and technology command as well. And his last role was the head of the military intelligence between 2001 till 2006. On his right-hand side, Professor Moshe Arens is seated, and whatever I may say about him, I believe, will not be able to summarize his very impressive CV, because one cannot say it all in just a few words. And you talk about the fact that he's a professor of aeronautics, is it not, from the Technion University, and in addition, if you're talking about the Director General of the Deputy Director General of the military industry. He was the ambassador of Israel in the United States, a member of Knesset, a minister without portfolio, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and the Minister of Defense at various terms of office. And the last period was from 1990, 1991, during the Gulf War, which was a very tough time for the State of Israel. And now he is an associate at the Zionist Strategy Forum and other positions as well. And then Mr. Shabtai Shavit, who served in numerous positions as well in the Israeli Mossad during 32 years of service, very impressive service. He commenced his service to the State of Israel as a warrior combatant in the Chief of Staff's command, and he reached the highest possible position in the Israeli Mossad between the years 1989 to 96. And after he left that position, then he filled various other roles in the social public sectors. He was the chairman, board of directors of the Maccabi Health Services, and he was a consultant on intelligence issues in the committee in the Knesset. He's the head of the Athena Commission today, and one of the inceptors of the ICT Institute of Counter-Terrorism. And on my left, my close left, is Mr. Yaacov Perry, who served in the Israel Security Agency from 1966 to 1995 in multifaceted roles in the field and as a commander. He filled all those central roles in the central GSS. And when you talk about people from the academe, they usually come with a CV with 40 pages long. But when someone comes, it's usually one line. He was the head of the GSS. And I think that everything else that he did could either be covert issues, things that you cannot discuss in the open. But when you talk about Yaacov, he filled many a role. And even when he did actually retire from that specific position, we must always remember that he did fill those roles during very tough periods of time for the State of Israel. He also dealt in other civic roles. He was a Director General of the Cellcom company, and today he's the chairman of the Mizrahi Bank and Littman Engineering. Believe me, I have sinned against all those sitting with me because it was so short what I said. Definitely only the highlights of their illustrious pasts and the roles they have played. And so therefore, if could each and every one of them now just give us a short sort of world view and assessments of the year that has passed and the year that is yet to come. So we're going to start with Yaacov, and then we will go in according to that order. I would like to congratulate for that initiative, for this encounter and a discourse between the various chairmen. There are those who are not as balding as yet, and there are those who are balding more. But it has been a tremendous privilege to work with them, beside them, alongside them. And I'm going to leave my more specific assessments to the actual discussion. And I think it would be correct to base what I'm going to say on views from the academe and from literature on relevant issues that this evening is going to deal with. And I'm going to open with a number of quotations written by Professor Asher Sossar that I read in a book that was a summary of discussion after the Second Lebanese War. And I would like to identify with nearly all the statements there that in the actual regional arena that we live in, I think that there are a number of trends whose impact about contemporary terror and future terror have the upper hand. And the most primary one is that the secular nationalism in the Western world seems to be weakening and stepping back. And now what is strengthened is the national statehood kind of policy. Another thing that is commonplace here in our region, and you can see parallels around the world, is a kind of repeat or reiteration of identities or Arab basic identity in religion, in one's state, in one's actual ethnic group, family, and most naturally going back to Muslim radicalism. And thirdly, which is parallel to the first two trends that I just mentioned, and that states that there is a strengthening of the strong powers that are not Arab ones, for example, the Iranian one, while on the other hand you have a Sunni moderate kind of state weakening. In other words, the Sunni world is now on the defense. It's on the defensive, and it is being threatened, and it fears its future because of the radical powers, the Shiites, the Al-Qaeda, and the cohorts of that. So therefore, the hope or the reaction of the Arabs that Israel would manage to curb the Iranian penetration into the Mediterranean basin, but Iraq has collapsed within its specific lines. What is happening? Lebanon is always on the brink of civil war. And the whole idea of a Palestinian unity has also collapsed. Egypt has been weakened in its peripheral areas, and only Jordan seems, apparently at least, to be sensing fortitude and showing its fortitude. But they have tried to make internal changes there, and it created a kind of political paralysis, and the alternative to that situation would only be civil war. So the Second Lebanese War did not have a decisive arm or blow to the Hezbollah. And in our normal reality in Lebanon, the Hezbollah has an interest at this time to have peace and let it reign on our border with Israel, and it will decide when it should violate that peace that reigns. In the Judean Samaria area, there is some kind of somewhat strengthening of the Palestinian mechanisms, the security mechanisms. They're even willing to, at times, sort of go into conflict with the armed other forces, the Hamas and the others. But unfortunately, they still depend on our GSS and the IDF. In the Gaza Strip, the Qassam missiles supply most of the passion and the appetite of the Islamic movements, especially when they are when the public opinion is Israel is so busy with it all, and therefore it does supply that satisfaction for their point of view. But the fundamental movements in the Gaza Strip is growing and escalating, and they're smuggling arms, and this is escalating from day to day. And in my assessment, that same potential that to break through when the Qassams stop, this might actually break through. This will escalate even more. I believe that beyond Iraq and beyond our region, there will be activities in our relative lull in the last 2 years vis-a-vis world terror will be violated, because the moment the American actions are strengthened in Iraq. And now a last word about us. I think that our abilities to foil and curb issues and thwart attacks, the gathering of our intelligence information have shown its signs, and I think that our trends are very important, and therefore I would like to congratulate the IDF, the police, and all of those who are dealing in these important issues. Our congratulations, they are doing so well.
Thank you very much, Yaacov, and we're moving on to Shabtai. Good afternoon. In 10 minutes, it's quite hard to cover this wide gamut of the topic, and therefore I'll try and do it very succinctly. A few words about the characteristics of global terrorism that I will begin with, and then from it I'll go down to the regional and local terrorism. Global terrorism expresses a conflict which is religious and cultural. We should bear in mind that since the 7th century to the end of the First World War, Islam was the victorious as a religion. At the end of the Second World War until today, Islam is regressing, and the assets of Islam, the cultural assets mainly, are dwindling. This Islam aspires to have a new order in the world. It's against the Moderna. It is for returning to the roots of religion. It is an Islam that will not accept coexistence. Therefore, there is no chance for negotiations. This Islam is virtual as an organization because it has no territory. Historically speaking, they started their activity in Sudan. After they were removed from Sudan, they moved on to Afghanistan, and after Afghanistan, they're looking for other areas, other regions of political instability, areas of conflict, in order to find themselves some pieces of territory from which they can act. When they do have some kind of territorial basis, they will be able to create a serious menace, a crucial mass. But without such a basis, their threat is limited. And what has to do with the regional arena, Hezbollah is an organization which is an arm of Iran. And it is a Shiite organization that identifies with Iran as a Shiite state. The Hamas and Islamic Jihad are two organizations with a mixed kind of motivation. Part of it is political and part of it is religious. On the political side, they want to have self-determination and sovereignty, knowing that if they do achieve sovereignty, the day after, they will turn the state or the territory into a Sharia state. It's Islamic law. In the world of terrorism, we need to distinguish between organizations and states. And the states that are today in this camp are Iran, that I already mentioned, and Syria. And Syria as a state is a secular state, but in order to promote their own political and strategic interests, the Syrians are using organizations that are radical Islamic organizations, the Islamic Jihad, Hamas and Hezbollah. And Syria is doing it not out of some kind of religious altruism or ideology, but of sheer, clear interests. It's important to say a word about what I call defining the victory in the conflict. The last Lebanon war was an arena that can serve as a case study in order for us to be able to define or help define the term of victory or defeat or failure. When we speak about organizations like the Hamas, Hezbollah, and Al-Qaeda, these are organizations that for whom territory is either completely irrelevant or secondary. And the test of victory or defeat is that of survivability. If you succeeded in surviving a conflict or a round of war, then you have won, according to the interpretation of those organizations. Because those organizations don't have a territory to defend. They don't deal with subjects of sovereignty and self-determination. They try to promote their religious and theological vision. Another word about Saudi, which is a case that stands per se. The Saudi Arabians may be state number one that promotes and disseminates Islam in the world. And it's doing it through peace and not through war. They are doing it with their money and other means like building mosques, building schools, sending religious people and mullahs and teachers that disseminate the Islam. And one needs to bear in mind that when there are no money limitations, it's quite easy to generate critical masses with these means, no less than with military ones. The next point I'd like to relate to is Iran, a nuclear Iran. How is nuclear Iran going to behave? A nuclear Iran, is it going to be pragmatic, or will it be messianic? In other words, will Iran be willing to use this ability, capability, in order to promote the idea of conquering the world and setting up the Khalifa, Islamic Khalifa, all over the world, and will be willing for that to go to the end and pay any price that involved? Or will their instinct of survival stop Iran just a second before they press the button? I think that no one has the answer yet. Therefore, we, just like other countries among the Western democracies, we have to act according to the extreme scenario and not according to alleviating circumstances with all the possible implications that may be involved. It seems to me that in the global situation, in the region and in the local area where we are living today, where the central characteristic is instability, the method according to which we should act is to manage the crisis and wait for better times when it will be perhaps possible, with the local or regional global conditions change, will be possible perhaps to reach achievements in reducing the conflict. I would like to point out that since September 11, 2001, global terrorism has not succeeded in carrying out another big bomb attack in the size and magnitude of that of the Twin Towers. Vis-à-vis this event, I'd like to point out the fact that the United States and the rest of the world, some more and some less, have quite soon learned lessons. And the world, I can say by and large, is building itself, preparing itself in order to be able to respond to this threat. And the fact that until today, no other event of the sort has been carried out is, to my mind, evidence that we indeed are coping quite well with the threats. Can we say that next year we are going to find the right way how to do away with the threats altogether? My answer is negative. Terrorism is here and will be here for quite a long time to come, and the world will have to contend with it for many years to come. The objective that we should aspire to is to succeed in limiting the phenomenon of terrorism and bring it to a level, with the best image that I can think of, is that the world will relate to it, or will be able to relate to it as it is relating to the phenomenon of road accidents. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Shabtai.
Professor Arens. I think, for the sake of due diligence, I think I would like to say that my colleagues around the table are professionals that for a plethora of years have dealt, most of them, fighting terror, in other words, in counter-terrorism, and they invited me, and I am a former politician, but as it was mentioned, I'm actually an aeronautics engineer. So they just asked him to put the microphone a bit closer. Should I start again? No, no, no. I'm going to try and relate to this whole topic of terror as succinctly as possible. I think someone who is considered a politician or a captain of a ship has to make decisions in counter-terrorism. I think that it is acceptable today that the common denominator of terror that is both a threat and a danger and a challenge for the whole free Western world is basically buried in the fanatic Islam, and the implications therefrom have grown out of the three monotheistic religions. The Islam is an issue for historians to deal about, and I won't be able to contribute a great deal on that issue. But the greatest question of all, I think, that is those of the decision makers that they have to tackle with now in fighting terror, is that those who are faced by this threat is, can we have a decisive blow against them? Can we actually have a decisive blow against them? And that is what Israel has been deliberating about for decades. In tremendous awareness, it was a dogma that stated that one cannot actually bring terror to its knees with military means. At least one cannot do it only with military means. One cannot defeat it by doing so. I think that we can defeat it. We can fight against it, but only through military means. I have to stress that, because we should not compromise or tempted to give in to those who are the perpetrators of terror. And I think that our harsh experience with this just proves this doctrine and this belief of mine. A question is also raised, and we seem to be reiterating it time and time again: can one actually deter terror? And the state of Israel is a very small state, but yes, it is strong, and it has not bad a record in its ability to deter. We haven't succeeded in deterring every possible jeopardy and threat, but because after all we weren't involved in wars, but we have had that deterrence power against aggression against us, but we did not succeed in deterring terror. And the proof of that is a daily one. And I think that it would also be right to say that one cannot deter against terror. And I would like to now delve perhaps a little more deeply into the explanation. What is the difference between aggression, which is state perpetrated, that has infrastructure, population, and this conflict with the tackling with a group of guerrillas or terrorists? The state of Israel has faced terror attacks, a murderous attack, which was unprecedented in its history, in the history of mankind, during the period that we called it the Second Intifada. A period in our history wherein mothers were frightened to send their children to school. A period wherein people feared to even get on buses. A period of time where the suicide bombers and those who are perpetrating attacks, sometimes daily, sometimes even twice or three times a day, were trying to carry out attacks. I don't think it would be presumptuous of me to say that we did defeat that Palestinian kind of terror. It took us time, yes. We started actively, perhaps doing so after slight lag, after the terrible murderous attack in the Park Hotel in Netanya. But you can see the results speak for themselves, and we did manage to diminish it somewhat. And it was only through military means that we managed to defeat it to a certain degree. Only through military means. It is interesting but also bizarre to come and say that at our zenith of success against the Palestinian terror, then the withdrawal took place through the disengagement program, which was interpreted by the terrorists, which we should have predicted in advance, that they would interpret it as such. They saw it as the terror had the upper hand rather than Israel. After all, that is why they thought it was because of the terror that we had the disengagement rather than vice versa. We are grappling with the Hezbollah terror movement, which is a fully fledged terror movement for over 20 years. We have not succeeded as yet in deterring them. We have grappled and tackled with them over numerous years, and we have paid a tremendous price for that objection, that resistance, as they also have paid a price. But this has taken a very long time, which appears even too long a period for the Israeli population. We've now come to a crossroads wherein we had to decide which direction we were going to move in. And my last decision as a Minister of Defense in June in 1999, after again Katyushas were being barraged against the Galilee. My direction was to the Air Force to attack the infrastructure in Lebanon. And in June, they destroyed 2 power plants, telephone infrastructure, main roads, and the Katyusha rockets did not continue. There was a lull. One cannot say whether this kind of lull could have continued, but it was at least exactly at the point when the governments changed places and Barak selected a completely different direction, not to deter, but rather to come to some kind of settlement with the Syrians, and all the rest is history, and the unilateral withdrawal from Lebanon and its implications. At the time, I thought that we could perhaps try and use some kind of deterrence, not against the Hezbollah, but vis-à-vis the Syrians, because that was a time that they had the upper hand in Lebanon, and they were able to rein in the Hezbollah, and they did so to a certain degree after the Air Force attack, but there was no reason for them to continue to do so after our policy changed in the State of Israel and Barak was the Prime Minister. So we have gone back to this whole issue of the resistance with Hezbollah now, this inability to deter their fighting of the Hezbollah in the Second Lebanese War. There was a doctrine of the previous Chief of Staff that by hitting out with a greater scope, perhaps, rather than in 1999, at the infrastructure in Lebanon, that we would be able to stop the Hezbollah attacks against us and the shooting of the rockets against the north of our country. I believe that that was a mistake, because I think that the situation had changed. The Syrians no longer had the upper hand. They did not have control of Lebanon in the time. I do not know if even at that time of the Second Lebanese War, whether they were capable of reining in the Hezbollah movement, but at least we could not succeed in doing so by hitting out at the infrastructure in Lebanon, and therefore we have come out of that war. It is, to my chagrin to say so, defeated by a number of thousands of the Hezbollah combatants and warriors. Now, day after day, we are fighting terror in the Gaza Strip. The Hamas and the Islamic terrorists, Islamic Jihad terror movement. And just over the last few days, we saw a couple of ideas that we could perhaps, have an upper hand by, again, hitting out at the infrastructure, by, for example, power cuts, movement curbing of movement. I, again, think that this is erroneous. I don't think it's efficient. I don't think it'll work, and I don't think it's moral either. In this kind of situation that exists that is rampant in the Gaza Strip, I think any detrimental effect on population and on the civil population, either by statistic shooting against the population to even the sources of the actual shooting, I think would be counterproductive, and it will create greater support for the jihad terrorist movements and the Hezbollah and the Hamas. I think that the simplest possible way, though the PM says that one cannot do it with one fell swoop, and there's no one magic wand solution. One cannot do anything. We're trying to do our best. Beyond that, we cannot do anything. The solution in this situation is simply to go in and try and remove the Qassam rockets from that range. The entrance should not be too deep, and only by so doing, the children from Sderot will be able to go to school every day and live peacefully. I think that the lesson to be learned in our war against terror is, in my opinion, are two perhaps lessons. First of all, military intelligence, and again military intelligence, and presence in the field. And I think that presence in the field is also connected to the whole issue of the gathering of military intelligence. And I think the whole basis of the defensive shield campaign and our presence in the field, which is still existent now, the GSS presence in the field, is the only way we can actually fight against the terror in the Gaza Strip. And now just one little issue about what's happening in Iraq. I am no specialist, I'm no expert. I'm just sad to see all these horrific problems that the Americans have there. But if we look at those problems that the Americans are grappling with, and those problems that we have been facing, I think that the main difference one could come and say is that we know the field, but we are capable of collecting intelligence, information. We have people who know the language. We have security officers who can look into various caves and 90% of the time see if there is a problem, are there explosives there, are there not? And I think that that is the main part of the problem with the Americans in Iraq at the moment, that they don't have that.
Thank you very much, Aharon. I'd like to congratulate the Institute. I believe that we, the State of Israel, are the lab of world terrorism. I compare it to Spain War, 1936 to 1939. That was a preparation for Second World War. Unfortunately, this is what is happening with us. Part of our success in coping well with terrorism is the result of development of know-how. And I would like to express my appreciation to the Institute in developing this know-how, and also congratulate you on your initiative to have this study day. You asked to relate the threats of terrorism in three arenas: the Palestinian arena, the Shiite, Hezbollah, and Al-Qaeda, and regional processes that impact them. I'll try to have my headlines present them in a concise manner and try and forecast what's going to happen in the next year. Four processes that I suggest that all of us, when we speak about the three arenas that Dr. Garon asked us to discuss, that we look at them as if it were a prism, because it's impossible to understand the kind of phenomena of terrorism that we cope with every day. The first phenomenon, the Iraqi war, was mentioned here. The Iraqi war changed the focus of terrorists and became the main laboratory since Afghanistan, and an operational experience that was acquired there. This is the school of terrorism. This is where terrorism is disseminated from to many countries and to Europe. And this school is very rich in experience and has a lot of contribution to many of the terror attacks outside Iraq itself. Another phenomenon is the dysfunctionality of the governments in Iraq, in Lebanon, in the Palestinian Authority. It is still an authority, not a state, and in Afghanistan. In these four places, the West has no solution, and this stems mainly from the fact that these governments are dysfunctional. It's not a situation that a strong government says, I'm going to take care of terrorism. No, sometimes they encourage it because they don't manage how to grapple with this. They have enough money to buy weapons, to issue acts of terror, but there is no money for food and for employment and for education. These are the same bodies It's clear where it exists today in Gaza since the Hamas came to power. So this is the second phenomenon. The third one was mentioned here. We have the break between the Sunni and the Shiite. This is really a wave of shock in the Western part, which is led by Iran through Baghdad in Alawi, Syria and Lebanon, vis-à-vis the moderate Shiite axis. And the world is now gearing up, and this fault line, has significance before Iran becomes nuclear. We're speaking here about a significant period in the getting ready of these blocks. Those that lead the moderate Sunnis are the Saudi Arabia and not Egypt. And I would like to subscribe with those who speakers who said before that paradoxically in an Arab Middle East there are three non-Arab superpowers: Iran, Turkey and Israel. And now I will begin with a few words about world terrorism of Al-Qaeda, the world jihad, and then I go down through Hezbollah to Palestinian terrorism. So what are the political lines of Al-Qaeda, and which I believe will continue until the Americans pull out of Iraq? With a sense of victory or of no victory. And that's very important for the region, whether the Americans are going to leave or not. It's very important also how the Americans will leave. It has a clear impact on what is going to happen to Hezbollah in Lebanon and to Hamas in the Gaza Strip, and Jihad Islami and Hamas in the both extremes of Judea and Samaria. And even the quiet in Saudi Arabia will be impacted by that. So the political guidelines that was changed in 1995 when it was decided that the Islamic revolution has to take place and Islamic Khalifa has to be generated from inside outside. If in the past they believed that it will be possible to have this revolution by changing this, by destroying the twins in Manhattan, in Al-Qaeda, they drew the lesson and said that was a mistake. We need to go into the core of Levant. This is where the jihad should begin. And this is Egypt and Jordan and Saudi Arabia and Israel. And I will skip mentioning to you the number of terror acts in Aqaba, in Amman, in Turkey, in these places very close to the core of the Levant. This is where the real revolution should start, and not in the extremes. This policy, I believe, will continue until they succeed in driving out the coalition forces headed by the Americans. And I would like to tell our friends who come to the United States. And what I'm saying is based on some estimates and some intelligence. There is a change from May of 2004 and 2005 of the change in Al-Qaeda because of the need to win in Iraq. So, as a second priority, fewer resources are going to America. And I believe that the moment this mission is completed in Iraq, the territory of the United States in Northern America will be again threatened by world terrorism unless it will be completely annihilated. You see spontaneous things. You saw 3 of them 2 months ago. 3 who succeeded, who the Americans succeeded in foiling in the United States, like blowing up a pipeline in the U.S. And you see this in Spain and other countries. These are secondary efforts because the main efforts today are within Iraq. And certainly continuing maintaining terrorism mainly in those countries that send forces to Iraq and Afghanistan. We see this in Britain, in Germany. 2 weeks ago, a special cell was found in Germany of people who converted into Islam. I would like to mention Richard Reed. Not Gere. Gere is somebody else. Richard Gere is somebody else. By the way, this is a very dangerous trend. Not only do Muslim people, like those cells in the UK, are second or third generation in Britain. They originated from Pakistan, and they were recruited in a club in Jersey. That is a very serious problem in a Western country, let alone France. There is a new phenomenon of people who convert to Islam. They are Christians, they look different, and it creates a problem regarding intelligence. This is the policy that I believe will go on, depending, of course, on what is happening in Iraq. Now, Hezbollah. The terrorist threat of Hezbollah has two dimensions. First of all, the arm that threatens to come out with new acts of terrorism in Judea and Samaria. There is a special unit called 1800. They are now planning those acts of terrorism. They had 55 agents that they trained, gave money to, and they were dealing with taking these acts of terrorism to be carried out in those places. The effort of this unit is focusing mainly on the Gaza Strip and helping, supporting the Hamas revolution in Gaza was also the result of help of Iranian as well as Hezbollah experts. The Iranian who helped the Hamas, helped the Islamic Jihad to get this training, to get these guidelines and try to help them in smuggling arms. We call these arms that violate the balance in the area. And anti-tank weapons, Katyusha rockets, not those rockets that are artisanal, that after 2 or 3 weeks fall apart and need to be reassembled. And as a result of this, there is a question of stock for launching. And the other one is anti-aircraft weapon. These are the three domains where they are making an effort to concentrate on. And this, of course, expands the areas that need to be protected. This is one dimension. Another dimension has to do with Lebanon. Improving the capability after the Second Lebanon War, where according to the updates that were given to the Knesset already, were mentioned by the Minister of Defense, it's this increase in the long-range Zilzal rockets that have 200 and so of kilometers, and strengthening the anti-aircraft defense. This strengthening has two motives. First of all, Hezbollah is the defender of Lebanon. We, the Hezbollah, will prove to the world that without us, Lebanon cannot be protected from the Israeli enemy, although we are not there. The security decision 425 will show it. So this effort should be reinforced, and we should be ready for the second round. And certainly the other field that has to do with Hezbollah is part and parcel of the defense system of Iraq. Actually, the IDF and our forces were fighting last year with Iranians that were trained there and were equipped there. And the doctrine is also from Iran. In 2005, the Iranian defense minister said that we see Hezbollah as part of the total system of defense of Iran, with Shihab 3 and the rockets that Lebanon has. The timing of change in this arena, I believe, only after exhausting the internal Lebanese process to weaken the Senora government and not allow it to have a responsibility according to the Security Council Resolution 1700. And the efforts right now are political. If they do not succeed, then only at default will they take another direction. If you ask me, and with this I will finish with Hezbollah, then paradoxically the most extremists, they are the ones, the Syrians because of the International Investigation Committee and its application regarding the Hariri assassination. And after all, it's the Iranians, because they don't want another explanation as long as they don't have nuclear weapons. And in the middle, you have Hezbollah. And they will weight it according to their interests, mainly. And let me wind up. Let me stop you on the Palestinian arena, because my first question is about the Palestinian. So we will have a chance to say that about the Palestinian arena. Shlomo.
Good evening. It seems a bit weird to to try and step into his shoes after Farkash's issue. I mean, don't forget that the whole issue of terror is a conspiracy, but after Major General Farkash's assessment, it's a bit difficult. But I would also like to second his congratulations for this convention here and the integration and the intermingling between the various people who've all come from different angles, those sitting on the podium, and they see things in a different way and understand things in a different way, but they're able to understand and assess and also to know what should be done. I think each one comes from his own individual angle, and therefore I would also just like to speak briefly about terror, and after that conclude with a few short issues that I think have an interface with this issue. And the basis of that is not how much terror or which terror will exist here, but the ability to counter it and to do what is needed. After all, our reality is changing, and the world is changing, and although sometimes our memories seem short, but terror didn't start just a few brief years ago, but on the contrary, it has been there for many a year. And if you look at the analogy between them, I think that we should remember that terror is not going to end, and there's no good reason why it shouldn't continue for many years, because that is not the situation. In addition to that, I think that one should know what their poisonous reasons and objectives of the terror are, and what we're going to do in order to tackle it. And what I think that the super objectives have changed, and Major General Farkash spoke about that just now. I think we ought to analyze the largest circles surrounding this issue and what the status is of the supercontinents, and one can see superpowers, and I think that we can identify from point of view of image of an inability, because don't forget this is also a war on image, on one's image, not only to curb or thwart and stop things and to foil an attempt against one additional fatality, but it's more than that. And I think that the main prisma that we ought to be looking through in order to understand things is to see what is happening in Iraq today. Iraq, in fact, represents both sides of the entire spectrum. First of all, United States and the abilities of the superpowers to have that decisive and don't forget why it started out with this war, what its aims were, and where we stand with those aims today, what the objectives were. And in addition to that, what happened in Afghanistan in the past and what might still happen, the ability of the actual location, that specific place, the ability to actually ability of a power like the United States. We can see so many processes taking place. Are we taking this arena with everything that is happening, the microcosmos perhaps of what is happening around the world, that this has an impact not only on its image but also the lessons that are to be learned by numerous entities and superpowers and countries and organizations. So that's a kind of circle that is very non-simple whatsoever, extremely complex in fact to look at, and we need to look at it and delve more deeply into it. And I'm not talking about all the issues of atomic energy and nuclear powers, etc. as well. Now we also have to look at the Shiite and the Hezbollah circle and the Palestinian circle, where we can also identify the same kind of processes, identical processes that we've seen in other places of the fanaticism basically taking over and disseminating these theories and doctrines to other places around the world. I think that those events that forged our belief in our ability to analyze what's going to happen in the future, and the process that's taking place in Lebanon, Iraq, and the power of Iran that is strengthening and increasing. I think that it's not only the amount of activities that is going on, but I think that the main test is its immense clout that is developing, and the fact that it is enlarged and expanding into greater circles and creating interests and vested interests in more and more circles, like a ripple effect, so that one day this will be tested. And I think that that is something we should look at, that is happening in Iran, and we should look at this cloud, not only what it is manufacturing, but at the cloud itself. We also have to see that there are different additional mechanisms around the world, and we ought to define terror as something statistical. It doesn't need to do something, a specific attack every day in order to have an impact. It's enough just to do something or create one situation that will destabilize an entire region. So even if the actual events seem to be decreasing or that they are minimal, but that does not mean that you can really understand what is expanding and what is developing simultaneously. I think that one can also mention an additional issue, that the world cohesion, despite everything that is happening, it is still not at its best. There are ups and downs and multiple nuances, lots of politics and vested interests and local interests, and I still cannot identify one cloud that can really counter terrorism, that can deter terrorism and can really actually defeat terrorism. I think that one of the main issues that have happened, and many local and international events that have had an impact on the internalization of the situation, that is a process that is developing. And if I'd like to summarize that, then I think that we have witnessed a process wherein terror is increasing and developing with greater abilities. It's intensifying itself with a greater arsenal of arms in the field, and therefore, as a derivative of that, we have to understand that we have to grapple with a different kind of terror, a stronger terror, or a different kind of one that is developing. I think that this kind of phenomenon that we are predicting, we know what its directives are, its objectives are, but we seem to forget that some of those processes are being nurtured by the clout of those who have to grapple with it. Now look at Israel, for example, and the way it has to counter all the terror and everything that is happening. I think, on the other hand, the cohesion in Israel and our resilience and our ability to tackle terror, unfortunately, is decreasing. And that is a variable which is extremely important variable that has to be taken into account when you analyze what is going to happen in the future, and of course what is happening in the present. We have a kind of lack of stability, governmental stability. In so many domains, we deal with the reality of 2007 with the tools of the year 1948 from the point of view of the balance and so many other issues. And therefore, unfortunately, we seem to be going backwards if you're talking about the enforcement of laws, or even a decrease in democracy, in our patriotism, and in other variables as well. And I must say that when I look at terror, I do not only look at one specific variable, but when I look at what is developing, I have to look at the other side as well, and to see how can we grapple with it, with what tools will we come and try and tackle. And that is what creates the various balances, not only with what is happening today, but I think which is even more important, what will happen in the future. And we have to look ahead with an internalization of what has happened in the past and try and implement those issues, those lessons that we have learned. I think it's a very important question. We have to know where we are going to and what do we expect of what is going to happen in the lendemain of what has happened in the past.
Right now, we are going to take each one of the arenas. We'll begin with the Palestinian arena. I will address questions specifically to the speakers and I'll ask them to be as brief as possible. If there are others who would like also to have their input, please feel free and barge in, but please be brief. Every arena is going to get 20 minutes, and we'll give the floor to 2 or 3 people here in the audience. Please avoid speeches and be succinct. The first arena is the Palestinian one, the Middle East. I would like to address this question to Yaacov Perry and Aharon Farkash. Actually, we are witnessing a process which we haven't seen before in last year and this year. It started with the elections and in the Hamas taking over in Gaza. Later on, it was even violent. I'd like to ask, what is the scenario that you can see as to the struggle between the Hamas and Fatah and the Palestinian Authority? To what extent the process of radicalization of Islam is ephemeral, or can we expect a process of bringing back the genie into the bottle? And what do you believe is going to be the real ability of Abu Mazen to set up a state and pose an alternative to the Hamas? You asked so many questions. I'll try and be brief, and you asked us to be brief, okay? I think that this Islamic radicalization is irrevocable, irreversible. You cannot bring back the genie to the bottle. I think that in every kind of settlement or agreement, regardless of what we call it, will finally have to deal with the same factors and come to some kind of tactical agreement, and will never get to a situation of an ideological agreement. Hence, you can see what my opinion is about the process itself. Maybe Abu Mazen is very weak, and he's trying to, to make believe that he is becoming stronger. But these voices that he's emitting, we, having no other alternative, we are committed to strengthening him. I pointed out the strengthening of the Palestinian defense mechanism, and also some kind of a beginning of a wish to confront the Hamas in Judea and Samaria. I can tell you that my estimates, and how, as my friend Farkash said, we should also take a risk. I believe that we are in for some kind of settling for something between the Fatah in Judea and Samaria and the radical government in Gaza. I don't think that we, the State of Israel, are going to play an important game in this compromise. It will be an internal Palestinian process. So as the more we hurry to, according to a government decision, of course, the more we hurry to get consensus regarding Judea and Samaria, thus the more possibility we have of getting some kind of control in the settlement that may occur between the Hamas and Fatah in the not so far future. As I pointed out, the Abu Mazen's weakness is well known to all. He's got a Western way of thinking, and he's got a lot of goodwill. to fight terrorism, but his abilities are almost nil. I also think, as I pointed out before, that the dwindling number of Qassams, speaking in the way Mr. Arens sees it, I think that we can succeed in bringing down the number of Qassam rockets. We are in for terror attacks, a wave of terror attacks, not improvised, but ones that will be using a lot of weaponry. Of that weaponry that goes into the Gaza Strip, those that arms them and trains them and creates an Islamic power that is much more threatening. Speaking about acts of terrorism on the border, in Israel, in Gaza, and even against the Egyptians in different kind of collaboration with the Islamic forces within Egypt. Aharon.
I would just like to remind the forum that I saw an interview with Sufyan Abu Zaida, who was a minister of convict on issues of prisons with a Palestinian. But in that semi-fitna, the sort of semi-civil strife, when there was a lull for a few hours, and when he came back from that kind of captivity for a few hours, he came back and described on Israeli television how a colonel from the Fatah was tortured. He was shot in his knees, and then he was shot in his back. And then he completed the interview by saying, you cannot imagine the depths of hatred between the Hamas and the Fatah. We will have peace with you, the Israelis, before there is peace with them, because that was the level of hatred, how they treated the others. So I want you to remind you all that what happened in the Gaza Strip, I think, has more chances of success than a danger or risks. We're talking about religious, extreme Islamic, an Arab Sunni doesn't exist anywhere else. I mean, he is in control of everything that is going on there. And I think that the significance from our point of view is that there is a clear foe, a clear enemy that has succeeded in achieving what he has, because he said that Islam is the response, it is the solution, and that same Islam has to supply everything, and give all the provisions, power, energy, everything. This is an opportunity now in the Judean Samaria that is also an opportunity, because I really believe that Abu Mazen does want to achieve it. The question is whether he's able to. I think we have to take advantage of that window of opportunity, and we have to understand what we can attain with what exists in the field at the moment in Judean Samaria. This situation is convenient for the envoys sent over, the previous Prime Minister of Great Britain, Tony Blair, who's been sent. This is a convenient situation for them, for the people from Europe, and for other people. And I think that we ought to take advantage of this situation. And I think that the place that we go down to on the 15th of September is where we will go down to in our negotiations as well. Don't forget that the GSS is now working in the Judea and Samaria, and the modus operandi of actually foiling terror is actually successful at the moment. If we do not, and I have said it before, if we do not add to that equation the population in the Gaza Strip, we will not reach a settlement. We are not terrorists. We should not reach a civil catastrophe, a humane catastrophe, because if we do not reach that situation wherein those perpetrators and sending those rockets, and we will not be able to solve that problem. We will not be able to succeed in doing so through military means.
Thank you very much. Right now I'd like to address three questions actually, to Misha Arens and Shabtai. If there is anyone who would like to ask a question regarding the Palestinian arena, you can already line up here before the microphones. Misha and Shabtai. I'd like to expand it a little and see what you think about the Palestinian Authority. What is your anticipation for the 5 years to come regarding the stability of those regimes in Jordan, Egypt, Syria, and what are the implications of a change? If you do see such a change, what implications may have on the Palestinian scene? You mentioned it, but I would like to expand this circle from the neighboring countries to Iraq too. What are the implications of American withdrawal from Iraq on the Palestinian scene? Is it stabilized, or is it going to be just, fleeing the area? Certainly, I am not the person equipped with the intelligence necessary to be able to say, to give some intelligent forecast regarding the stability of those regimes in Egypt or Jordan or Saudi Arabia. What is closer to us and even more significant is the stability of Abu Mazen's regime. We heard recommendations how to behave with him, how to support him. Again, I'm not equipped with intelligence, certainly not on the level that those people around me are, but we have to take into account when we try to forecast the result of the confrontation or the hate between the Fatah and Hamas, that they already won the round number 1. They won big and relatively in an easy manner. And I believe that this does mean something about their chances, their ability in Judea and Samaria, or that there is no difference between Gaza and Judea and Samaria. What does it mean to help Abu Mazen, who maybe is about to lose? What does it mean to help Abu Mazen by letting know that we're going to give up Temple Mount? I'm not sure that the chance here is close to the risk, or that it is equal to the risk. Farkash already said the quiet in Judea and Samaria is a result of the fact that we are present there. We learned one thing after that terrible disengagement, that the presence in the area is necessary, it's vital. We can come closer to Abu Mazen by decreasing our presence there. They speak about doing away with some roadblocks. I can't say that all the roadblocks are necessary, but I would say, hey, wait. Let's not open up a new front in Judea and Samaria vis-a-vis towards these cities on the coast in Israel. Now, the implication of an American defeat, if this happens, I would give the example of the disengagement. The implications of the disengagement, where somebody said they were tailwind to terrorism. If it's true or not, this seemed to be a victory for terrorism. And it's really hard to understand how our people, the professionals too, could not foresee it, what the perception will be in the other side. They spoke only about the perception on our side as a step towards peace. We are getting rid of Gaza, we are pulling out of Gaza, we're solving the demographic problem, we're doing this and we're doing that. What is the perception on the other side? Somebody said, why didn't you ask what's going to be the day after? And I assume that the victory of terrorism in Iraq will have very similar implications, maybe on a larger scale, implications on the West, and that will include us in their leaving. But the alternative is to stay in Judea and Samaria. I remember Do I remember correctly? I had the pleasure of working with you when you were Minister of Defense. You were of the greatest staunch supporter of leaving Gaza, if I'm not mistaken. Mr. Arens answered, if you remember well, at the time we were in entire Gaza, Jabalia, the city of Gaza, everything. Within Jabalia, there was an IDF post. When I saw this, I said we didn't need that. It doesn't mean that we should have uprooted all the people from the Katif block. Katif block is not Gaza, maybe formally speaking, in the mandatory plans. It has nothing to do with this. When I express my opinion, I say there is no way of taking care of the Qassam rockets but this. I think this is intolerable. By the way, this is also construed as a defeat. This too is a tailwind to terrorism, that the Hamas people with these primitive weapons can frighten the children of Sderot. The only way is not exactly too complicated, is to take them out of range. So somebody will say, then they will have longer rockets, longer range rockets. Well, we'll cross the bridge when we reach it, but we have Qassams falling on the road day in, day out. So how long are we going to stay if we go into Gaza? 5 kilometers, and the answer will be as long as the children in Sderot need this protection, as long as we see the danger. I don't think this is something that's going to go on for many, many years. There will be changes in the Middle East, we know that. But in the meantime, we need to defend ourselves. Wherever we leave or pull out, we make terrorism come closer. If we haven't learned this lesson, we haven't learned anything.
You asked us to try and give a forecast for the next 5 years. Well, in the Middle East, 5 years is an eternity. But perhaps a number of observations. I think that what is happening in Iraq today is a process of dismantling, perhaps, of Iraq, a collapse of Iraq. Not from the point of view of the significance of that it is going and slowly vanishing or disappearing, but rather the centers of power are being decentralized from the center out into the periphery. And a situation is being created that the Kurds in the north, the Kurds in the north have never had it so good as they are enjoying the situation today. All they need to do is to declare their independence and they will become an independent country. The other region is the Sunnite region, which is in the center, on the western side, and the Shiites in the south. I think that the strength, the power, is moving outwardly into those various counties and even the legislation and the regulation is being done so, is also moving outwardly in that same way. So anything that is connected, for example, to income from fuel, from the oil, there's also been a legislation that income is being divided between the various ethnic groups, and that has also a territorial significance. And number two, I don't think that a democratic administration in the United States, and that is one of the possibilities in the next elections in the United States, that there might be a democratic administration. I don't think that in their first 100 days of the first democratic president, he will withdraw from Iraq. He will take out the forces from Iraq. I think that there will be a lot of noise created and about their withdrawal from Iraq, but I think perhaps that here and there that will be some kind of slow, gradual, controlled process of narrowing down and decreasing the American presence there. But I don't foresee, for me to foresee things and predict things for 5 years, I think that in the Middle East, I think that only fools can afford to have such prophecies. But I do not foresee any dramatic act that tomorrow morning the Americans will suddenly salute and leave Iraq. There's so many things that are connected to its specific own internal defense and security and its status around the world, so they can't suddenly fold everything up and leave. Now, the president Mubarak in Egypt, he's no longer a spring chicken. Their president and their Muslim ideology. And I think that for many years already the regime has known how to grapple with the Muslim brethren's threat very wisely and in a savvy manner. Often they perhaps took rather grave steps, even perhaps giving them a little more space to maneuver in. But still, this threat still exists, and perhaps in the next 5 years we will see in Egypt some kind of regime change in Egypt. Mubarak would perhaps love to see his son Gamal taking over and walking in his footsteps. And perhaps that might happen. But at any rate, the act of a change of government in Egypt could be a point which is extremely sensitive in my eyes. And it could perhaps be some kind of catapult for the more extremist forces in the country to take over Egypt. I don't think there is really such a chance, but it's a possibility. And in Jordan, we have a young king who's running his country pretty well and who is being supported very strongly by his own army and the Bedouins in his own state. He's now received a kind of infusion, a boost of Iraqi exiles who left Iraq and moved to Jordan. Some of them, I would say the lion's share of these, brought with them financial means. They're quite affluent, and they brought, of course, this into Jordan, and therefore this final balance, will this be in the best interest of Jordan or not, we're not quite sure. Yes, there are advantages, but perhaps there's some disadvantages too. I believe that the chance of a change of regime there and an overtake by a coup of extremists, I think, is very minimal, even less than it is in Egypt, of that actually happening. I think my forecast for the countries in that region and their influence and impact on the Palestinians, there's a certain measure here of connected vessels here, because I think that if Egypt is going to become a Muslim country, then undoubtedly the Hamas in the Gaza Strip, if it is still there, will then flourish. But on the other hand, if the Middle Eastern countries succeed in preserving their more secular character, then I believe that the Hamas may be an ephemeral or a phenomenon that just passes. And the question is, what will we do? I actually would like to second that opinion that says that One cannot be in a situation wherein day after day the sovereignty of the state of Israel is being violated and we are not doing what we ought to be doing. I don't think that it is precedented around the world that a sovereign state should be absorbing every single day a violation of its sovereignty and does not react. The Hamas, till this very day, I mean, you talk about the Gaza Strip, it's a very limited area, the Gaza Strip. It doesn't have a depth, it doesn't have a strategic depth to it. It's a limited space. And I think that one can grapple with that situation. And
just one word. I'd like to add a short sentence, rather. I think that the policy that tries to take care and cope with the size of the flames is one that cannot last for long. Therefore, it's true that many acts should be taken. I think that there is a confusion here between this engagement and the commitment of a state to defend its citizens. There is no connection, no contradiction here. I quite understand why the military resolve to act in Gaza today is there. Why it doesn't really take place, because we carry traumas with us. It has got nothing to do with this engagement. We are carrying these traumas with us, so the considerations whether to go into Gaza or not are not good ones, because a country, a state, should defend its citizens. It's the way to defend the citizens, the residents of Sderot, is to get into Gaza and take this action. Then it is agreed by all that it should be done. But I'm saying that over time, it's very important to try and lead moves that not only keep the flames, but also wait to see what is happening on the other side, whether the extremist Islam is going to take over or not, and speak about much larger processes. And I agree with Mr. Perry that there may be no choice for us, but we will have to make concessions in the future in order to try and change this vicious circle that we only try to contain the fire rather than put it out. Thank you very much, Shlomo. Please identify yourself and be brief. In your question, please address it to a person whom you would like to get the answer from.
Since you didn't name the person, I'll ask Farkash to answer that, but not now. I want to collect several questions all together. Please, say.
My name is Itzhak Sokolov. My question is addressed to Mr. Farkash and Mr. Perry. As far as a world's view, vis-a-vis intelligence, I'd like you to look 15 years back to the beginning of the Oslo process and also look forward. The question is, when does an Israeli compromise or concession become turn from a lever for peace into a lever to terrorism? And can this be analyzed from the professional point of view when it is neutralized from views? Another question?
What you said before about a window of opportunity, I just wanted to share and have comment. I was, as part of my research, in Ramallah 3 days ago, and sitting in a cafe and watching on the television, watching with people in Ramallah what's going on in Gaza, and the Hamas with their sticks beating the population. And the next day when I left Ramallah, which was Saturday, there was an anti-Hamas demonstration in the square with many in attendance. I also heard about a desire for Palestinian unity, hatred towards Hamas, disillusionment with Fatah, which looks like a window of opportunity, and I wanted to share that. And at the same time, there's a lot of hatred towards Israel, less ideological hatred and more practical issues of checkpoints, humiliation at checkpoints, inability to travel, etc., etc. So I wanted to kind of share that and find out what, how can you take advantage of this window of opportunity, which I seem to see, taking place personally, and at the same time deal with the hatred based on practical, not ideological issues. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing this with us. And since I don't refer to that as a question, last question, please.
Meli Polishuk blog. I would like to ask 2 questions. No, just one. You pick. What is the weight of Palestinian prisoners that are 10,000 sitting in prisons in Israel, and why don't we use them as a way to combat terrorism? And the same question now. Israel is going to publish the names of 2,000 or 3,000 that they want to release. They will publish it in the Gaza press. Will it not cause more pressure of the population, more pressure than just stopping water and cutting off power, knowing that the prisoners are as important as Gilad Shalit is to us? And a short comment. I was of those in the Knesset, as a member of Knesset, that voted for disengagement. And I think that disengagement is the right step. Although I was against leaving the northern part of the Strip and against the Rafah agreement, yet there is no proof that disengagement strengthens terrorism and not the previous processes that brought us to the current situation. Thank you very much. Last question now.
Yaacov Lapin from Ynet. Do we have Katyusha rockets in Gaza today? Do they exist there? So it's going to be a quick round, and then we'll move on to the next issue. We'll start with Farkash. I'm going to try and answer in brief. I indeed think that one's worldview does have an impact on the way we read our reality, and I think all of us, and of course those who do deal in military intelligence issues also, that has an impact on them. And sometimes we see what we don't want to see, or we do want to see, and there's a risk, yes. And of course one ought to create some kind of, all organizations are built in such a way that you have a kind of opposite tension created. We had a forum, and we'd meet with them once every 6 weeks with people who I truly looked up to, and I asked them the same questions that I asked my people in order to see reality in different ways. There are other entities. There's a very clear tension that exists between the intelligence people and the general security services. It always exists, and I think that it is possible. I never coordinated my stand and my viewpoint with Avi Dichter before we met with the PM. They based their knowledge on something and their findings on something. They thought that the barrel of terror had no bottom to it, and we thought that they did have. And now you can judge who was right there. So it's a very sensitive issue. I think that the intelligence entities are aware of that. We want to create that tension so that there will be as few human weaknesses as possible that have an impact. Yes, sometimes we succeed, sometimes less. And now the transit from the Shunites to the Shiites. Now, in the Gaza Strip, the moment the regime, the Hamas regime, in order to show them contempt, they were called Shiites. I know that in the Alawite area of Syria, in order to bring them closer to the Shiites, it was very important for the Iranians. So if you're talking about dawah, because they wanted the Alawites in the Syria to be as close as possible to the Shiites. We know that millions were invested and given to the Alawites, and Hafez al-Assad would have really turned in his grave had he heard that. Invested in them in order to bring them closer. And I think that this phenomenon is something pinpointed. It isn't too extensive, but it calls out to both sides, basically. And I think that the rift during the Ali periods between the Shuna and the Shia, it's very difficult to bridge between this rift, and I don't know how one can actually rectify this rift or bring them closer. Just one little interpolation. The person who asked the question said that he's a contractor of the American Ministry of Defense. But I think that we should put things in proportion. We're talking about a Muslim world. We're in that 1.3 billion Muslims around the world, and we're talking about terror, Muslim terror, which has every hue and nuance and color possible. And sometimes it is but 10% of the total of the Muslim population around the world that are part of it. The Shiites, from its very first day of its inception, when it was forged, it has always been an ethnic group which is a minority in the Islam. So I would like to calm you, the person who asked the question, but a situation wherein there are conversions from Shuna to Shia, I think one should say is really pinpointed and very few and far between, and they are not as a threat per se against the Muslim Shuna. Don't you think that they are the extremists, Al-Qaeda, for example, don't you think that they are the worst of all of them? Okay, I'm going to try and relate to 2 or 3 questions. The person who asked that question was formulated beautifully. When does Israel's concessions turn from one leverage of peace into something for the sake of terror? So I think that it's a political question, because if one looks at it, its distilled, pure side. Of course, we could academically analyze things. Someone sitting beside me, I admire immensely. We could allow him to do it easily. We could even finance it if he does an analysis, and if there's an initiative for concessions or the Oslo Accords. What happened to terror? I'm sure that we would have a first-class scholastic academic project. But you cannot just leave this as it is without adding political worldviews, because otherwise it would be isolated from reality. And let us not forget that this is something that ought to be explored and delved deeply into it, and we could talk for many a day about it. But I think that the Oslo Accords were cut short, and I don't think that it was seen correctly, I think now, in hindsight. And now the the question that was asked, I don't think that this is the right place for one-upmanship when that question was asked from the floor. We could analyze those issues about the disengagement. Now, there are 1,500 convicts who are the really tough Palestinian detainees. And some of them are because for various punitory reasons that they are there. At some point, we were flooded with people who were arrested or detained because they threw stones. And I think that they hadn't caused real casualties, but the fact that they were incarcerated was something that we had to do. It was obligatory. And I would just like to say, and I'm doing so very cautiously, that any of our governmental conduct vis-à-vis this issue of the detainees, or those who are missing in action, or those who have been kidnapped, I think that anything we ought to do has to be done so cautiously, is not done in an organized fashion. I can't see an actual work program to suddenly announce that we are willing to release 2,000 detainees. I think would create more pandemonium and more pressure than turning off the power. It might be a good idea, on the other hand, but someone in our government has to sit down and consult with the Institute for Defense and Security Issues, which though the government for some reason doesn't consult with, and they ought to think, and there should be some wonderful, blessed initiatives, and then maybe they ought to sit down together and we would be able to bring our missing soldiers home. But it is not being done, and hopefully in this new year, it will be a new year with a harbinger of good tidings, and things will be done.
And the Lebanese Shiite arena, I'd like to address the question to Mr. Arens, Shabtai, and Shlomo. What are the lessons that you believe we should draw from the Second Lebanon War in the immediate term? And I'll point out at what point I'd like to touch upon. There is quite a common thought that the next round with Hezbollah is just a question of time. And in this respect, I'd like to hear your opinion. What does Israel need to do in case of abduction of soldiers on the border, or shooting high trajectory fire on Israel? How should Israel respond to the armament of Hezbollah? And something to you specific, Shlomo, some lesson regarding the home front in case another war breaks out in the north. One lesson, and I think this is self-evident, and I hope that it was really absorbed amongst the politicians, is that when one threatens, one should carry out a threat. There is no better way than deteriorating our deterrence than threatening and not carrying out the threats and having no intention to carry it out. And after the unilateral withdrawal from Lebanon, it was very difficult to find politicians. There are politicians for everything. Some politicians can say, okay, I was mistaken. But I cannot imagine that we'll hear Ehud Barak say that the pullout from Lebanon was a mistake. I believe that he was 100% all right to pull out of Lebanon. But the threats that he sounded as a Prime Minister and Minister of Defense at the time of what would, God forbid, happen if there is any kind of provocation on part of Hezbollah after we withdrew, and in brackets, will have all the legitimacy in the world that in the past we did not have, apparently. When we were sitting on Lebanese soil, 6 years went by, soldiers were kidnapped, some returned as bodies, Katyusas were fired, people were hurt in the Galilee, and nothing was done. I hope that this lesson has been finally assimilated. By the way, similar thing happened after the disengagement. There were also talk. After the disengagement, we pulled up to the 67 line, including the northern part. That's something I did not agree to, like it was in Yamit, in Sinai. That was complete stupidity to make the Qassam rockets closer to Ashkelon and to those areas. So again, threats were hovering in the air that after this pullout, there will be no quiet. Then, God forbid to the people if they dare do anything against Israel. I hope that we will not go back to this. I would like to point out one lesson that apparently was learned, which I believe is the wrong lesson, totally wrong. And this is the focusing on the home front. Or as if all of a sudden we woke up to the fact that we had a serious problem with the home front. And that in the next war, we'll have to take care of the people back home. We'll have to protect homes and develop systems that will push away, intercept the rockets in the air, and that nobody will be able to hurt the home front. The home front command that I heard on television and in the Knesset said that the problem of home front is a problem of a decisive blow at the front. We cannot protect the entire country or the entire city of Sderot, but we will not solve the problem of the Qassam rockets by protecting schools in Galilee or in Sderot. The old doctrine of Ben Gurion that the war has to be taken into the enemy's territory and make sure that the people fighting home should remain safe is as good today as it was many years ago. Shabtai. I'd like to go back to what I said at the beginning. As far as the lesson, my lesson, certainly the most important lesson from the last Lebanon war. In the conventional wars that the world experienced in the last 100 or 150 years, the war was between sovereign states. The war was between armies. At the beginning of the day, those forces were pitted against the others. Complete armies of armored corps and infantry and artillery beat one another until at the end of the day, I'm doing this very schematically, of course, just to stress the point, until at the end of the day, one of the sides had to raise a white flag, surrender, and the supreme goal in that kind of war was to get to victory through conquering territory and and exterminating the enemy. The combination of these two things dictated success, victory or defeat. In today's world, when the enemy is terror organizations that are not the landlords in territories that are not states, the criterion for victory or defeat is completely different. The Hezbollah organization in previous war and in future wars does not have to defend a territory. The Hezbollah needs to survive. And if they survive this round of the conflict, they are on the right track for fulfilling the divine instruction in the war for the conquest of the world and in setting up the Islamic Khalifa. The lesson is that against such organizations, the meaning of territory doesn't exist, or it is secondary, and we need to adopt, to embrace a doctrine where the test of a victory is how many enemy soldiers you killed, how much weaponry you destroyed, how many military infrastructure you destroyed, and the final balance of the damage you caused the enemy is the real criterion to say at the end of the day whether you won the war or lost it. Thank you. Shlomo. If anybody wishes to ask a question, please line up here with the microphone. 2 or 3 points that to me are the central lesson of the last war that we had in last summer. Number 1 is the need, and I continue what Shabtai said, the need to re-examine the way we see security and the lexic that explains it, finding out what is victory and what is defeat, because these are processes that unless we know how to define, we will not be acting in the right arena and in the right way. And the war that ends is sometimes perceived in a different manner because our terminology was different. The war in the field was with another series of terms. This is war and guerrilla, but not an army, different terminology. And I believe that this is the first lesson. The second lesson is the home front, and I repeat this once more. I agree with what Misha said. It is not necessary and not good, not possible to protect the home front completely, but we need to relate to the home front that the problem in the last war was the disregard or the lack of clear policy and the lack of clarity for us as to the role of the home front and how we manage the problems in the home front. And that has implications in another topic, that is the determination and the might that we must have in sustaining casualties and still going forward in order to get to the victory that we have to know exactly what it is. And the last third point, which also important, is not allow the genie to develop, to expand, but try to delay it. I'm not saying that this means that for every shot fired there should be a raid into enemy territory. And this is also an important lesson that we are dragging since the last war. But we must understand that whatever we don't touch and wait with, this increases and becomes so much bigger that the problems are double.
Our time has run out, so I'm going to stop the discussion now. I found it fascinating. We didn't deal specifically with the global arena, unfortunately, but I'd like to invite this panel for next time as well. And although I said that I want each of you to learn a specific insight, perhaps, but instead I will leave it for another time. I think that my personal lesson is that we need more time for such a panel. So thank you very much and good night.